Perdusz. Chapter 4. From Port Perdusz to Avventura. 1. On the docks. A favorable wind blew Cugel in his bed over the hills in comfort and convenience. As he drifted over the last ridge, the landscape dissolved into far distances, and before him, from east to west, spread the estuary of the River Chang in a great sweep of liquid gunmetal. Westward along the shore, Cugel noticed a scatter of moldering gray structures, Port Perdusz. A half-dozen vessels were tied up at the docks. At so great a distance, Cugel could not distinguish one from the other. Cugel caused the bed to descend by dangling his sword and boots over either side, so that they were seized by the forces of gravity. Driven by capricious gusts of wind, the bed dropped in directions beyond Cugel's control and eventually fell into a thicket of tulsifer reeds only a few yards inland from the river. Reluctantly abandoning the bed, Cugel picked his way toward the river road, across soggy turf rampant, with a dozen species of more or less noxious plants: russet and black burdock, blister bush, brown-flowered hearse, sensitive vine which jumped back in distaste as Cugel approached. Blue lizards hissed angrily, and Cugel, already in poor humor owing to contact with the blister bush, reviled them in return. "Hiss away, vermin! I expect nothing better from such low-caste beasts." The lizards, divining the gist of Cugel's rebuke, ran at him by jerks and bounds, hissing and spitting until Cugel picked up a dead branch and by beating at the ground kept them at bay. Cugel finally gained the road. He brushed off his clothes, slapped his hat against his leg, taking care to avoid contact with spatterlight. Then, shifting his sword so that it swung at its most jaunty angle, he set off toward Port Perdusz. The time was middle afternoon. A line of tall deodars bordered the road. Cugel walked in and out of black shadow and red sunlight. He noticed an occasional hut halfway up the hillside and decaying barges along the riverbank. The road passed an ancient cemetery shaded under straggling rows of cypress, then swung toward the river to avoid a bluff on which perched a ruined palace. Entering the town proper, the road swung around the back of a central plaza, where it passed in front of a large semicircular building, at one time a theater or concert hall, but now an inn. The road then returned to the waterfront and led past those vessels which Cugel had noticed from the air. A question hung heavy in Cugel's mind. Might the Galante still lie in port? Unlikely, but not impossible. Cugel would find most embarrassing a chance confrontation with Captain Bont, or Drofo, or Madame Soldink, or even Soldink himself. Halting in the roadway, Cugel rehearsed a number of conversational gambits which might be used to ease the tensions. At length he admitted to himself that, realistically, none could be expected to succeed, and that a formal bow, or a simple and non-committal nod of the head, would serve equally well. Maintaining a watch in all directions, Cugel sauntered out on the decaying old wharf. He discovered 3 ships and 2 small coastwise vessels, as well as a ferry to the opposite shore. None was the Galante, to Cugel's great relief. The first vessel, and farthest downstream from the plaza, was a heavy and nameless barge, evidently intended for the river trade. The second, a large carrack named Leucidion, had been discharged of cargo and now appeared to be undergoing repairs. The third, and closest to the plaza, was the Avventura, a trim little ship, somewhat smaller than the others, and now in the process of taking on cargo and provisions for a voyage. The docks were comparatively animated, with the passage of drays, the shouting and cursing of porters, the gay music of concertinas from aboard the barge. A small man, portly and florid, wearing the uniform of a minor official, paused to inspect Cugel with a calculating eye, then turned away and entered one of the nearby warehouses. Over the rail of the Leucidion leaned a burly man wearing a striped shirt of indigo blue and white, a conical black hat with a golden chain dangling beside his right ear, and a spigoted golden boss in his left cheek, the costume of the Castilian shorelanders. Cugel confidently approached the Leucidion and, assuming a jovial expression, waved his hand in greeting. The shipmaster watched impassively, making no response. Cugel called out, "A fine ship. I see that she has been somewhat disabled." The shipmaster at last responded, "I already have been notified in this regard. Where will you sail when the damage is repaired?" Our usual run, which is to Laticut and the Three Sisters, or to Woy if cargo offers. I am looking for passage to Almery, said Cugel. You will not find it here, said the shipmaster with a grim smile. I am brave but not rash. In a somewhat peevish voice, Cugel protested. Surely someone must sail south out of Port Perdusz. It is only logical. The shipmaster shrugged and looked toward the sky. If this is your reasoned opinion, then no doubt it is so. Cugel pushed impatiently down at the pommel of his sword. How do you suggest that I make my journey south? By sea. The shipmaster jerked his thumb toward the Avventura. Talk to Wiskich, he is a dilk and a madman. With the seamanship of a blue mountain sheep. Pay him terces enough and he will sail to Jahan itself. This I know for a fact, said Cugel. Certain cargoes of value arrive at Port Perdusz from Saskervoy and are then transshipped to Almery. The shipmaster listened with little interest. Most likely they move by caravan such as Yetkomos or Varmus. Or for all I know, Wiskich sails them south in the Avventura. All dilks are mad. They think they will live forever and ignore danger. Their ships carry masthead and lamps so that when the sun goes out, they can light their way back across the sea to Dilklusa. Cugel started to put another question, but the shipmaster had retreated into his cabin. During the conversation, the small portly man in the uniform had emerged from the warehouse. He listened a moment to the conversation, then went at a brisk pace to the Avventura. He ran up the gangplank and disappeared into the cabin. Almost at once he returned down the gangplank where he halted a moment, then ignoring Cugel, he returned at a placid and dignified gait into the warehouse. Cugel proceeded to the Avventura, hoping at least to learn the itinerary proposed by Wiskich for his ship. At the foot of the gangplank, a sign had been posted which Cugel read with great interest. Passengers for the voyage south, take note. Ports of call are now definite. They are Mahaz and the Misty Isles, Lavraki Real, Octorus, Cayenne, various ports of Almery. Do not board ship without ticket. Secure ticket from ticket agent in gray warehouse across wharf. With long strides, Cugel crossed the wharf and entered the warehouse. An office to the side was identified by an old sign, Office of Ticket Agent. Cugel stepped into the office where, sitting behind a disreputable desk, he discovered the small portly man in the dark uniform, now making entries into a ledger. The official looked up from his work. Sir, your orders? I wish to take passage aboard the Avventura for Almery. You may prepare me a ticket. The agent turned a page in the ledger and squinted dubiously at a set of entries. I am sorry to say that the voyage is fully booked. A pity. Just a moment, there may be a cancellation. If so, you are in luck, as there will be no other voyage this year. Let me see. Yes. The hierarch Hoppel has taken ill. Excellent. What is the fare? The available billet is for first-class accommodation and victualling at 200 terces. What? Cried Cugel in anguish. That is an outrageous fee. I have but 45 terces to my pouch, and not a groat more. The agent nodded placidly. Again you are in luck. The hierarch placed a deposit of 150 terces upon the ticket, which sum has been forfeited. I see no reason why we should not add your 45 terces to this amount, and even though it totals to only 195, you shall have your ticket, and I will make certain bookkeeping adjustments. That is most kind of you, said Cugel. He brought the terces from his pouch and paid them over to the agent, who returned him a slip of paper marked with characters strange to Cugel. And here is your ticket. Cugel reverently folded the ticket and placed it in his pouch. He said, I hope that I may go aboard the ship at once, as now I lack the means to pay for either food or shelter elsewhere. I am sure that there will be no problem, said the ticket agent. But if you will wait here a moment, I will run over to the ship and say a word to the captain. That is good of you, said Cugel, and composed himself in a chair. The agent departed the office. 10 minutes passed, then 20 minutes, and half an hour. Cugel became restless and, going to the door, looked up and down the wharf, but the ticket agent was nowhere to be seen. Odd, said Cugel. He noticed that the sign which had hung by the Avventura's gangplank had disappeared. Naturally, Cugel told himself. There is now a full complement of passengers, and no need for further advertisement. As Cugel watched, a tall, red-haired man with muscular arms and legs came unsteadily along the dock, apparently having taken a drop too many at the inn. He lurched up the Avventura's gangplank and stumbled into the cabin. "Ah," said Cugel. "The explanation is clear. That is Captain Wiskich, and the agent has been awaiting his return. He will be coming down the gangplank any moment now." Another 10 minutes passed. The sun was now sinking low into the estuary, and a dark pink gloom had descended upon Port Perdusz. The captain appeared on the deck to supervise the loading of supplies from a dray. Cugel decided to wait no longer. He adjusted his hat to a proper angle, strode across the avenue, up the gangplank, and presented himself to Captain Wiskich. "Sir, I am Cugel, one of your first-class passengers." "All my passengers are first-class," declared Captain Wiskich. "You will find no pettifoggery aboard the Avventura." Cugel opened his mouth to stipulate the terms of his ticket, then closed it again. To remonstrate would seem an argument in favor of pettifoggery. He observed the provisions now being loaded aboard, which seemed of excellent quality. Cugel spoke approvingly. "The viands appear more than adequate." "It would seem that you set a good table for your passengers." Captain Wiskich uttered a yelp of coarse laughter. "First things come first aboard the Avventura. The viands are choice indeed. They are for the table of myself and the crew. Passengers eat flat beans and samola, unless they pay a surcharge for which they are allowed a supplement of Cugel." Cugel heaved a deep sigh. "May I ask the length of the passage between here and Almery?" Captain Wiskich looked at Cugel in drunken wonder. "Almery? Why should anyone sail to Almery? First one mires his ship in a morass of foul-smelling weeds 100 miles across. The weeds grow over the ship, and multitudes of insects crawl aboard. Beyond is the Gulf of Swirls, then the serene sea, now bedeviled by pirates of the Jardine coast. Then, unless one detours far west around the Isles of Cloud, he must pass through the Leucidion and a whole carnival of dangers." Cugel became outraged. "Am I to understand that you are not sailing south to Almery?" Captain Wiskich slapped his chest with a huge red hand. "I am a dilk and know nothing of fear. Still, when death enters the room by the door, I leave through the window. My ship will sail a placid course to Laticut, thence to Alhalambar, thence to Witch's Nose and the Three Sisters, and so back to Port Perdusz. If you wish to make the passage, pay me your fare and find a hammock in the hold." "I have already bought my ticket," stormed Cugel. "For the passage south to Almery by way of Mahaz. That pest hole? Never. Let me see your ticket." Cugel presented that document afforded him by the purported ticket agent. Captain Wiskich looked at it first from one angle, then another. "I know nothing of this. I cannot even read it. Can you? That is inconsequential. You must take me to Almery or return my money to the sum of 45 terces." Captain Wiskich shook his head in wonder. "Port Perdusz is full of touts and swindlers. Still, yours is a most imaginative and original scheme. But it falls short. Get off my ship at once. Not until you pay me my 45 terces." And Cugel laid his hand suggestively on the pommel of his sword. Captain Wiskich seized Cugel by the collar and seat of the trousers, frog-marched him along the deck, and heaved him down the gangplank. "Don't come back aboard. I am a busy man. Ahoy, draymaster. You still must bring me another load. I am in haste to make sail. All in good time. I still must dispatch a load to Varmus for his caravan. Now pay me for the present consignment. That is how I do business, on a cash basis only."
"Then bring up your invoice and we will check off the items. That is not necessary."
"The items are all on board. The items are on board when I say they are on board. You will take none of my terces until that moment. You only delay your last consignment, and I have Varmus's delivery to make. Then I will make my own tally and pay by this reckoning." Never. Grumbling for the delay, the draymaster went aboard the Avventura. Cugel went across the wharf and accosted a porter. "A moment of your time, if you please. This afternoon I had dealings with a small fat man in a dark uniform. Where can I find him at this moment?" "You would seem to speak of poor old Master Sabas, whose case is tragic. At one time owned and managed the draying business. But he went senile and now he calls himself Sab the Swindler to everyone's amusement. That is his son, Master Yoder, aboard the Avventura with Captain Wiskich. If you were foolish enough to give him your terces, you must now think of the act as a kindly charity. for you have brightened the day of poor, feeble-minded old Master Sabas. Perhaps so, but I gave over the terces in jest, and now I want them back." The porter shook his head. "They are gone with the moons of ancient earth." "But surely Master Yoder reimburses the victims of his father's delusions." The porter merely laughed and went off about his duties. Yoder presently descended the gangplank. Cugel stepped forward. "Sir, I must complain of your father's actions. He sold me passage for a fictitious voyage aboard the Avventura, and now aboard the Avventura, you say?" asked Yoder. "Precisely so, and therefore in that case Captain Wiskich is your man." So saying, Yoder went off about his business. Cugel glumly walked back to the central plaza. In a yard beside the inn, Varmus prepared his caravan for its journey. Cugel noticed 3 carriages, each seating a dozen passengers, and 4 wagons loaded with cargo, equipment, and supplies. Varmus was immediately evident, a large man, bulky of shoulder, arm, leg, and thigh, with ringlets of yellow hair, mild blue eyes, and an expression of earnest determination. Cugel watched Varmus for a few moments, then stepped forward and introduced himself. "Sir, I am Cugel. You would seem to be Varmus, director of the caravan." "That is correct, sir. When, may I ask, does your caravan leave Port Perdusz?" "Tomorrow, in the event that I receive all my stores from the indolent dray master." "May I ask your itinerary?" "Certainly. Our destination is Torquil, where we will arrive in time for the Festival of Ennoblements. We travel by way of Kasparavitatis, which is a junction point for travel in several directions. However, I am obliged to notify you that our roster is complete. We can accept no more applications for travel. Perhaps you wish to employ another driver, or attendant, or guard." "I have ample personnel," said Varmus. "Still, I thank you for your interest." Cugel disconsolately entered the inn, which, so he found, had been converted from a theater. The stage now served as a first-class dining hall for persons of fastidious taste, while the pit served as a common room. Sleeping chambers had been built along the balcony, and sojourners could overlook both the first-class dining hall and the common room below merely by glancing from their doors. Cugel presented himself to the office beside the entrance, where a stout woman sat behind a wicket. "I have just arrived in town," said Cugel in a formal voice. "Important business will occupy me for the better part of a week. I will require food and lodging of excellent quality for the duration of my visit." "Very good, sir. We will be happy to oblige." "Your name? I am Cugel. You may now pay over a deposit of 50 terces against charges." Cugel spoke stiffly. "I prefer to pay at the end of my visit, when I can examine the bill in detail. Sir, this is our invariable rule. You would be astonished to learn of the scurrilous vagabonds who try every conceivable trick upon us. Then I must go find my servant who carries the money." Cugel departed the inn. Thinking that by chance he might come upon Master Sabas, Cugel returned to the wharves. The sun had set. Port Perdusz was bathed in wine-colored gloom. Activity had diminished somewhat, but drays still carried goods here and there among the warehouses. Sab the swindler was nowhere to be seen, but Cugel had already put him aside in favor of a new and more positive concept. He went to that warehouse, where Yoder stored his victuals, and stood waiting in the shadows. From the warehouse came a dray driven not by Yoder, but by a man with a ruff of ginger-colored hair, and long bristling mustaches with waxed points. He was a person of style who wore a wide-brimmed hat with a tall green plume, double-toed boots, and a mauve knee-length coat embroidered with yellow birds. Cugel removed his own hat, the most notable element of his costume, and tucked it into his waistband. As soon as the dray had moved a few yards along the wharf, Cugel ran forward and accosted the driver. He spoke briskly. "Is this last load for the Avventura? If so, Captain Wiskich does not appreciate so much unnecessary delay." The driver spoke with unexpected spirit. "I am indeed loaded for the Avventura. As for delay, I know of none. These are choice viands, and careful selection is of the essence." "True enough. No need to belabor the point. You have the invoice?" "I do indeed. Captain Wiskich must pay to the last terce before I unload so much as an anchovy. Those are my strict instructions." Cugel held up his hand. "Be easy. All will go smoothly. Captain Wiskich is conducting business over here in the warehouse. Come, bring your invoice." Cugel led the way into the old gray warehouse, now dim with dusk, and signaled the driver into the office marked ticket agent. The driver peered into the office. "Captain Wiskich? Why do you sit in the dark?" Cugel threw his cloak over the driver's head and tied him well with a wonderful extensible rope, then gagged him with his own kerchief. Cugel took the invoice and the fine, wide-brimmed hat. "I will be back shortly. In the meantime, enjoy your rest." Cugel drove the dray to the Avventura and drew up to a halt. He heard Captain Wiskich bawling to someone in the forecastle. Cugel shook his head regretfully. The risks were disproportionate to the gain. Let Captain Wiskich wait. Cugel continued along the wharf and across the plaza to where Varmus worked among the wagons of his caravan. Cugel pulled the driver's wide-brimmed hat low over his face and hid the sword under his cloak. With the invoice in hand, he sought out Varmus. "Sir, I have delivered your load of victual, and this is the invoice, now due and payable." Varmus, taking the invoice, read down the billing. 330 terces? These are high-quality viands. My order was far more modest, and was quoted to me at 200 terces. Cugel made a debonair gesture. "In that case, you need only pay 200 terces," he said grandly. "We are interested only in the satisfaction of our customers." Varmus glanced once more at the invoice. "It is a rare bargain. But why should I argue with you?" He handed Cugel a purse. "Count it, if you like, but I assure you that it contains the proper amount." "That is adequate assurance," said Cugel. "I will leave the dray here and you may unload it at your convenience." He bowed and departed. Returning to the warehouse, Cugel found the driver as he had left him. Cugel said, "Sat," to loosen the bonds and place the wide-brimmed hat upon the driver's head. "Do not stir for 5 minutes. I will be waiting just outside the door, and if you stick out your head, I will lop it off with my sword. Is that clear?" "Quite clear," muttered the driver. "In that case, farewell." Cugel departed and returned to the inn, where he placed down a deposit and was assigned a chamber on the balcony. Cugel dined upon bread and sausages, then strolled out to the front of the inn. His attention was attracted by an altercation near Varmus's caravan. Looking more closely, Cugel found Varmus in angry confrontation with Captain Wiskich and Yoder. Varmus refused to surrender his victuals, until Captain Wiskich paid him 200 terces plus a handling charge of 50 terces. Captain Wiskich, in a rage, aimed a blow at Varmus, who stepped aside, then struck Captain Wiskich with such force that he tumbled over backwards. The crew of the Avventura was on hand and rushed forward, only to be met by Varmus caravan personnel carrying staves, and the seamen were soundly thrashed. Captain Wiskich, with his crew, retired into the inn to plan new strategies, but instead they drank great quantities of wine and committed such nuisances that they were taken by the town constables and immured in an old fortress halfway up the hill, where they were sentenced to 3 days of confinement. When Captain Wiskich and his crew were dragged away, Cugel thought long and carefully, then went out and once more conferred with Varmus. "Earlier today, if you recall, I requested a place in your caravan." "Conditions have not changed," said Varmus shortly. "Every place is taken." "Let us suppose," said Cugel, "that you commanded another large and luxurious carriage, capable of carrying 12 in comfort. Could you find enough custom to fill these places?" "Without doubt. They now must wait for the next caravan and so will miss the festival. But I leave in the morning and there would be no time to secure the supplies." "That too can be effected if we are able to arrive at a compact. What do you suggest?" "I provide the carriage and the supplies. You recruit 12 more travelers and charge them premium prices. I pay nothing. We divide the net profits." Varmus pursed his lips. "I see nothing wrong with this. Where is your carriage?" "Come, we shall get it now." Without enthusiasm, Varmus followed Cugel out along the dock where finally all was quiet. Cugel boarded the Avventura and tied his rope to a ring under the bow and threw the end to Varmus. He kicked the hull with his ossip-charged boots, and the vessel at once became revulsive of gravity. Debarking, Cugel untied the mooring lines, and the vessel drifted up into the air, to the amazement of Varmus. "Stretch! Line, stretch!" called Cugel, and the Avventura rose up into the darkness. Together Varmus and Cugel towed the ship along the road, and somewhat out of town, and concealed it behind the cypress trees of the graveyard. The two then returned to the inn. Cugel clapped Varmus on the shoulder. "We have done a good night's work, to our mutual profit." "I am not apt for magic," muttered Varmus. "Weirdness makes me eerie." Cugel waved aside his apprehensions. "Now, for a final goblet of wine to seal our compact, then a good night's sleep, and tomorrow we set off on our journey."